It was a bright autumn afternoon when the incident occurred at Pine Valley High School. The basketball court echoed with squeaking shoes and cheering students during the girls' inter-school championship game. Among the players was Ming, a talented sophomore known for her quick moves and determination. The game was intense, with only 2 minutes left on the clock and the scores tied. Ming had the ball, dribbling swiftly toward the basket. As she jumped to make the shot, an opposing player accidentally collided with her. The crowd watched in horror as Ming's body twisted awkwardly in the air before she crashed onto the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. The gymnasium fell silent. Ming's scream of pain cut through the stillness like a knife. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and even from the bleachers, everyone could tell this was no ordinary injury. Her teammates rushed to her side, their faces pale with concern. Coach Rodriguez immediately called for the school nurse, while Ming's best friend, Priya, held her hand, trying to keep her calm. "It hurts so much," Ming sobbed, gripping Priya's hand tighter. "I can't move my leg." The school nurse arrived quickly and assessed the situation. "This needs immediate medical attention," she declared, already dialing for an ambulance. "It looks like a severe break." Within minutes, the ambulance arrived at the school. The paramedics carefully transferred Ming onto a stretcher, trying their best to minimize her pain. Priya insisted on accompanying her friend to the hospital, and the paramedics agreed, knowing having a familiar face nearby would help keep Ming calm during the ride. As they arrived at Metropolitan General Hospital, Ming's pain had intensified. Tears streamed down her face as the paramedics wheeled her into the emergency room. The waiting area was moderately busy, but Ming's obvious distress should have warranted immediate attention. Instead, they encountered Nurse Walsh, who barely looked up from her computer screen as they approached the reception desk. "Fill out these forms," she said flatly, sliding a clipboard across the counter. Her tone was as cold as the hospital's sterile walls. "But she's in severe pain," Priya protested, gesturing to Ming, who was whimpering on the stretcher. "Her leg is clearly broken." Nurse Walsh finally glanced their way, her expression unchanged. "Everyone here has their problems," she replied dismissively. "Take a seat and wait your turn. We'll call you when we're ready." The paramedics exchanged concerned looks before they had to leave for their next call. Ming was transferred to a wheelchair, her injured leg awkwardly extended, causing her to wince with every small movement. Priya stayed by her side, trying to distract her friend from the pain while simultaneously keeping an eye on the nurse's station. They watched in disbelief as patients with minor complaints, a sprained wrist, a mild fever, even a simple headache, were called in before them. An hour passed, then 2. Ming's leg had swollen considerably, and the pain was becoming unbearable. Her usually bright face was now pale and covered in a sheen of sweat. "Please," Priya approached the desk again, her voice trembling with a mixture of concern and frustration. "My friend really needs help. She's getting worse." Nurse Walsh's response was even more cold than before. "If you keep coming up here, it'll only take longer. Sit down and wait like everyone else." What Nurse Walsh didn't realize was that her callous behavior was about to have serious consequences. She had no idea that Ming's father, Dr. Chen, wasn't just any doctor. He was the hospital's new owner. He had recently acquired Metropolitan General as part of his mission to improve healthcare quality in the community, though he had kept a low profile during the transition period. At that very moment, Dr. Chen was attending a medical conference in another city. His phone buzzed with an urgent call from his wife, who had just received a panic-stricken message from Priya about Ming's condition. Mrs. Chen's voice shook as she explained the situation to her husband. Dr. Chen's usual calm demeanor shifted to concern as he listened to the details of Ming's injury and the treatment, or rather, lack of treatment, she was receiving. He immediately ended his presentation mid-session and headed for his car, but not before making a crucial phone call to the hospital's administrative office. Meanwhile, back in the waiting room, Ming had started to develop chills, a possible sign of shock. Priya had wrapped her friend in her own jacket and was trying to keep her warm while fighting back tears of helplessness. Other patients in the waiting room had begun to notice the situation, with several of them expressing their concern to Nurse Walsh, only to be met with the same cold indifference. An elderly gentleman even offered to give up his spot in line, saying Ming's condition clearly needed immediate attention. But Nurse Walsh simply ignored his gesture of kindness, continuing with her rigid and unsympathetic approach to patient care. The clock on the wall ticked past the 3-hour mark since their arrival. The bright afternoon sun had given way to early evening shadows, and still Ming sat there, untreated and in agony. The pain medication given by the paramedics had long since worn off, leaving her to deal with the full brunt of her injury. Little did anyone know that this seemingly endless waiting room nightmare was about to come to an abrupt end. Dr. Chen was already on his way, his car cutting through traffic as he maintained phone contact with hospital administrators. The events that would unfold in the next few hours would not only change Ming's situation, but would transform the entire emergency room's approach to patient care. The story of what happened that day would soon spread throughout the hospital corridors, becoming a powerful reminder of why compassion and proper patient assessment should always take precedence over bureaucratic procedures. But for now, Ming continued to wait, unaware that her father was about to arrive and turn this horrible situation on its head. This marked just the beginning of a chain of events that would reshape Metropolitan General Hospital's entire emergency care system, though neither Ming Pryor nor the dismissive Nurse Walsh could have predicted the magnitude of change that was about to unfold. While Ming sat suffering in the emergency room, her father, Dr. Chen, was racing down the highway, his heart pounding with worry. He had worked his entire life to build his medical career, starting from humble beginnings as the son of immigrant parents who ran a small grocery store. Through decades of dedication, he had risen to become one of the most respected physicians in the state, and just 3 months ago, he had fulfilled his dream of purchasing Metropolitan General Hospital. He hadn't made a big announcement about the ownership change, preferring to observe how the hospital operated in its natural state before implementing any major changes. "Sometimes you need to see the true colors of people when they don't know they're being watched," he had told his wife. Now, those words felt painfully prophetic. As he drove, his phone connected to the car's Bluetooth system rang again. It was Mr. Lee, the hospital's head administrator, calling with an update. "Sir, I've just reviewed the security footage from the emergency room." Mr. Lee's voice was tight with concern. "Your daughter has been waiting for over 3 hours now." The nurse on duty, "Well, you should see this for yourself." Dr. Chen's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Tell me about this nurse," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Nurse Walsh has been with us for 15 years, Mr. Lee explained. She has a track record of being efficient, but there have been complaints about her bedside manner. Nothing serious enough to warrant action before, but this situation," his voice trailed off. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, things were getting worse. Ming's face had grown even paler, and Pryor noticed her friend's hands were cold and clammy. Other patients in the waiting room had formed a sort of protective circle around the two teenagers, with one kind woman offering them water and another sharing her granola bars. An older man who introduced himself as Mr. Patel had been watching the situation unfold while waiting for his own appointment. As a retired teacher, he couldn't stand seeing a young person in such distress. He approached the nurse's station for the 3rd time, his voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, I've been watching that young lady for hours now." "This isn't right," he said, standing tall despite his arthritic knee. "I've been teaching for 40 years, and I know when a child is in serious pain. Please take my spot in line. I can wait." Nurse Walsh barely glanced up from her computer. "Sir, we have a system here. Everyone waits their turn. If you're so concerned, perhaps you should find another hospital." Unknown to Nurse Walsh, her interaction with Mr. Patel was being observed by Ms. Rodriguez, the night shift supervisor who had just arrived. Ms. Rodriguez had been briefed about the situation during shift change and was quietly gathering information while pretending to sort through patient files. Dr. Chen was now just 20 minutes away from the hospital when his phone rang again. This time it was his wife, who had been texting with Pryor for updates. "They still haven't seen her," she said, her voice shaking. "Our baby is suffering, and they're just letting her sit there." The usually calm and composed doctor felt a mixture of emotions he hadn't experienced in years: worry for his daughter, anger at the situation, and disappointment in the system he had recently taken responsibility for. He thought about all the times he had lectured medical students about the importance of compassionate care, about seeing patients as people rather than numbers. Back in the waiting room, a small drama was unfolding. A young mother with a crying baby had just arrived, and to everyone's surprise, Nurse Walsh immediately ushered them in. While no one begrudged an infant getting quick care, the contrast in treatment was striking. Priya, usually shy and reserved, felt something snap inside her. She stood up, her voice carrying across the room with unexpected strength. "How is this fair? Look at her leg. She needs help now." The waiting room fell silent except for Ming's soft whimpers of pain. Several patients nodded in agreement with Priya's outburst. Mr. Patel placed a supportive hand on Priya's shoulder, while other patients began to murmur their own disapproval of the situation. Nurse Walsh stood up, her face flushed with annoyance. "If you can't control yourself, I'll have to call security," she threatened, reaching for her phone. Just then, the elevator doors opened and Mr. Lee hurried out, followed by several hospital board members who had been urgently summoned. They had received word that Dr. Chen was minutes away, and they wanted to assess the situation before he arrived. The scene they encountered was telling: a waiting room full of concerned citizens, a clearly suffering teenager, and a nurse who seemed more interested in maintaining her authority than providing care. Mr. Lee's face darkened as he took in the situation, especially when he noticed Ming's leg, now swollen to nearly twice its normal size. What happened next would become hospital legend, told and retold by staff members for years to come. The main entrance doors swung open and Dr. Chen walked in, still wearing his conference lanyard and carrying his travel bag. He had driven 3 hours in record time, his daughter's pain fueling his determination to reach her. The moment he entered, time seemed to stand still. He was a man who had spent decades healing others, now forced to witness his own child suffering needlessly in the very institution he owned. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew the truth. But what made this situation truly remarkable wasn't just the fact that the hospital's owner's daughter had been neglected. It was how this incident would spark a complete transformation in the way Metropolitan General approached emergency care. The changes that would follow wouldn't just benefit Ming, they would improve the experience of every patient who walked through those doors in the future. As Dr. Chen strode toward the emergency room, his presence commanded attention even though most staff members didn't yet know who he was. Years of medical practice had given him an air of quiet authority that made people naturally step aside. The real storm was about to begin, and Nurse Walsh had no idea that her next interaction would change not only her career, but the entire hospital's approach to patient care. This moment marked the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through every department of Metropolitan General. But for now, all Dr. Chen could focus on was reaching his daughter, whose brave face finally crumpled at the sight of her father coming to her rescue. The emergency room fell into an eerie silence as Dr. Chen approached the nurse's station. His footsteps echoed against the tile floor, each step measured and purposeful. The other patients, who had been witnesses to the previous hour's events, watched with intense interest, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "I'm here about the young lady with the broken leg," Dr. Chen said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both professional authority and parental concern. "She's been waiting for over 3 hours." Nurse Walsh didn't look up immediately, her fingers continuing to type on her keyboard. "Everyone has to wait their turn," she replied, using the same dismissive tone she'd been wielding all afternoon. "If you're another concerned bystander, I'll tell you what I told the others." "I'm not a bystander," Dr. Chen interrupted, his calm voice carrying a steel edge. "I'm her father, and I'm also the owner of this hospital." The typing stopped. The entire waiting room seemed to hold its breath. Nurse Walsh's head snapped up, her face draining of color as she finally made eye contact with Dr. Chen. Recognition flickered in her eyes. She had seen his photo in the hospital newsletter announcing the ownership change, but like many staff members, she had never met him in person. Dr. Chen, she stammered, suddenly standing up. I didn't realize." Clearly, he said, his gaze sweeping the waiting room before returning to her. "But that's not the point, is it? Whether she's my daughter or anyone else's child, no patient should be left in this condition." Mr. Lee, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward with a folder in his hands. "Dr. Chen, I have the wait time records here. And the security footage." "First, my daughter needs medical attention," Dr. Chen cut in. He turned to where Ming sat in her wheelchair, Priya still faithfully by her side. The The sight of his daughter's swollen leg and pain-stricken face made his heart clench. A team of medical staff, alerted by Mr. Lee moments earlier, was already rushing forward with a gurney. Dr. Chen supervised as they carefully transferred Ming, his experienced eyes noting every wince and grimace on her face. Pryor started to step back, but Ming grabbed her hand. "She stays with me," Ming said through gritted teeth, and Dr. Chen nodded his approval. As Ming was wheeled away for immediate treatment, Dr. Chen turned back to address the situation at hand. The waiting room had become surprisingly full, not with patients, but with hospital staff who had heard whispers of what was happening. Nurses from other departments, orderlies, and even doctors who weren't on duty had gathered to witness this unprecedented moment. "Everyone," Dr. Chen announced, his voice carrying clearly through the space, "what happened here today is unacceptable. Not because the patient is my daughter, but because this could have been anyone's child, parent, or loved one." He turned to Nurse Walsh, who seemed to have shrunk behind her desk. "You've worked here for 15 years, correct?" She nodded mutely. "Then you've had 15 years to learn the most fundamental principle of healthcare, that we treat people, not numbers. That pain and suffering demand our immediate attention and compassion." Mr. Patel, the retired teacher who had tried to intervene earlier, stood up from his chair. "Sir, if I may." When Dr. Chen nodded, he continued, "I watched your daughter suffer for hours. But what truly disturbed me was seeing how many others tried to help, other patients offering their spots, people begging for her to be seen, and how all of these human gestures were dismissed. Other patients began sharing their observations, describing how they had witnessed not just medical negligence, but a fundamental lack of empathy. Each story added another layer to the picture of systemic failure that had developed under the surface of the hospital's operations. Dr. Chen listened to each account, his expression growing more determined with each story. Finally, he turned to Mr. Lee. "Call an emergency staff meeting for tomorrow morning. Every department head, every supervisor. This ends now." Nurse Walsh, finding her voice at last, began to defend herself. "We have protocols, procedures. I was just following the system." "A system that ignores human suffering is a system that needs to change," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "And those changes begin today." He addressed the waiting room again. "To every patient who has been waiting here today, I apologize. Each of you will receive immediate attention from our other ER staff. And to those who showed kindness to my daughter, who offered their spots in line, who spoke up against what they knew was wrong, thank you. You demonstrated the very humanity that should be at the core of healthcare." As if to underscore his words, several nurses from other departments immediately began assisting the waiting patients, creating a stark contrast to the previous hours of neglect. The atmosphere in the emergency room transformed from one of frustrated resignation to purposeful activity. Mr. Lee approached with an update on Ming's condition. The X-rays confirmed a clean break that would require surgery, but she was now receiving proper pain management and care. Dr. Chen nodded, relieved but not satisfied. He knew that while his daughter would heal, the deeper wounds in the hospital's care system needed immediate attention. Nurse Walsh remained at her station, her earlier authority deflated, watching as her long-standing routines and procedures were swept aside in favor of a more humane approach to patient care. She would soon learn that this day marked not just a personal reckoning, but the beginning of a complete overhaul in how Metropolitan General approached emergency care. As the evening progressed, word of what had happened spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff members who weren't even present began discussing what this would mean for their departments, their procedures, their daily interactions with patients. Change was coming, and everyone could feel it. This revelation wasn't just about exposing poor practice, it was about rediscovering the fundamental purpose of their profession. As one young nurse was overheard saying to another, "Maybe sometimes it takes seeing something broken to remember how it should really work." Dr. Chen spent the rest of the evening divided between checking on Ming's treatment and beginning the groundwork for the sweeping changes that would follow. This day would be remembered not just for the drama of its revelations, but for the transformation it sparked in Metropolitan General's approach to patient care. The next morning arrived with a sense of anticipation hanging in the hospital air. The large conference room on the third floor was filled to capacity by 7 a.m., with every department head, supervisor, and key staff member present. The usual morning chatter was noticeably absent. Instead, there was a tense silence as everyone waited for Dr. Chen to arrive. Ming had spent the night in the hospital after successful surgery on her leg. Dr. Chen had stayed by her side until she was comfortably settled, then spent most of the night reviewing hospital policies and patient complaints from the past year. The stack of files on his desk told a story that went far beyond one incident. As Dr. Chen entered the conference room, the silence deepened. He carried no papers, no presentations, just a simple notebook. His face showed the weariness of a sleepless night, but his eyes were sharp and focused. In the front row, Nurse Walsh sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Good morning," Dr. Chen began, remaining standing. "Yesterday, many of you witnessed or heard about an incident in our emergency room. But what happened yesterday isn't just about my daughter. It's about every patient who has walked through our doors feeling scared and vulnerable, only to be treated like a number rather than a person." He paused, looking around the room. "I spent the night reading through our patient feedback from the past year. The stories I found are troubling. An elderly man who waited 6 hours with chest pain because his symptoms weren't dramatic enough. A child with a severe allergic reaction who wasn't seen because she wasn't crying loud enough. This isn't healthcare. This is bureaucracy at its worst." The room remained silent, but heads began to nod. Many of the staff had witnessed similar situations but felt powerless to change the system. "I bought this hospital 3 months ago," Dr. Chen continued, "not as a business investment, but because I believed we could make it a place of healing and hope. Yesterday showed me how far we have to go." He walked to where Nurse Walsh sat. "Stand up, please," he said quietly. She rose slowly, her face pale but composed. "You've worked here for 15 years, he said. "In that time, how many lives do you think you've impacted?" "Thousands, I suppose," she replied softly. "And in those 15 years, what changed? Did you become more efficient at processing patients or more effective at healing them?" The question hung in the air. Nurse Walsh's professional facade cracked slightly. I was following the protocols, trying to keep order. There are so many patients, and we have to have a system." "Yes, we need systems," Dr. Chen agreed. "But systems should serve people, not the other way around. Yesterday, I watched security footage of you dismissing not just my daughter's pain, but the basic human compassion shown by other patients. That stops today." He turned to address the room again. "From this moment, we're implementing immediate changes. First, every emergency room patient will be assessed within 15 minutes of arrival, not just their paperwork, but their actual medical condition. Second, we're creating a new position of patient advocate in every department. Third, we're launching mandatory compassion training for all staff, starting with our emergency room team." The room buzzed with whispers. These were significant changes that would affect every aspect of hospital operations. "As for you," he said, turning back to Nurse Walsh, "you have a choice to make. You can either be part of this change, starting with a 2-week intensive training program in patient care and emergency assessment, or you can tender your resignation. The choice is yours, but it must be made today." Nurse Walsh's hands trembled slightly. I would like to stay," she said quietly. "I realize now that somewhere along the way, I lost sight of why I became a nurse in the first place." Dr. Chen nodded. "Then your retraining begins today. Sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our most important learning." He addressed the room once more. "I want every person in this hospital, from the surgeons to the cleaning staff, to understand one thing. We are here to heal people. That means treating not just their injuries or illnesses, but their fears, their dignity, and their humanity." The meeting continued for another hour as Dr. Chen outlined specific changes and assigned responsibilities. Staff members who had remained quiet for years began speaking up, sharing their own observations and suggestions. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of pent-up frustration with a system that had prioritized procedure over people. By the time the meeting ended, there was a new energy in the room. Staff members lingered, forming small groups to discuss implementation plans. Even Nurse Walsh was engaged in conversation with the emergency room director, taking notes about the new assessment protocols. Dr. Chen's final words resonated through the hospital halls. "Yesterday was a wake-up call. Today, we begin building the hospital our community deserves. Every patient who walks through our doors should feel what we would want our own family members to feel: safe, respected, and cared for. As the staff dispersed to begin their day, there was a shared sense that they had witnessed not just a meeting, but the beginning of a transformation. The changes wouldn't be easy, but they were necessary. Metropolitan General was about to become a very different kind of hospital. Dr. Chen's last stop before checking on Ming was the emergency room. The atmosphere there was already different. Staff members were making eye contact with patients, nurses were doing regular check-ins with those waiting, and there was a new sense of purpose in the air. Small changes, perhaps, but they marked the beginning of something much bigger. The story of what happened that day would become part of hospital lore, retold to new staff members as an example of how one incident could spark meaningful change. But more importantly, it would serve as a constant reminder that in healthcare, the human element should never be forgotten. 1 week after the emergency room incident, the changes at Metropolitan General were already visible. The once sterile waiting room now featured comfortable seating, a children's play area, and most importantly, a dedicated triage nurse who checked on patients regularly. But the real transformation was happening behind the scenes. Ming, still recovering in the hospital's orthopedic ward, had become an unexpected catalyst for change. Her room had turned into an informal gathering spot where staff members would stop by, not just to check on her recovery, but to share their experiences with the new systems being put in place. "You wouldn't believe how different it feels down in the ER now," a young nurse told Ming one afternoon while checking her vitals. "Yesterday, we had a rush of patients after a minor bus accident. Before, it would have been chaos. But with the new assessment protocols, everyone was treated quickly and properly." Ming's father visited every day, splitting his time between overseeing her care and implementing the hospital's new policies. He made a point of walking through different departments daily, talking with staff and patients alike, learning firsthand how the changes were affecting everyone. Nurse Walsh, meanwhile, was deep into her retraining program. The transformation in her approach was remarkable. Under the guidance of a veteran nurse educator, she was learning to balance efficiency with empathy. The change wasn't easy. Years of ingrained habits had to be unlearned, but she was determined to prove herself. One morning, she gathered the courage to visit Ming's room. She found the teenager working on homework with Priya, who still visited daily after school. Both girls looked up as she entered, and there was a moment of awkward silence. "I owe you both an apology," Nurse Walsh began, her voice soft but steady. "What I did, or rather what I didn't do, was inexcusable. I've spent the past week learning how to be a better nurse, but more importantly, how to be a better human being." Ming looked at her thoughtfully. "You know what was worst?" she said. "Not the pain, but feeling like I didn't matter. Like my suffering wasn't important enough." Nurse Walsh nodded, fighting back tears. "I understand that now. Your father's training program, it's made me remember why I became a nurse in the first place. To help people, not just process them." The conversation that followed was honest and healing. Ming shared how the experience had affected her, while Nurse Walsh explained how years of dealing with an overwhelming system had gradually hardened her heart. By the time she left the room, something had shifted, not just between them, but in Nurse Walsh herself. The hospital's changes weren't just procedural. Dr. Chen had initiated a complete cultural transformation. Staff members were encouraged to share their concerns and suggestions through regular feedback sessions. A new mentoring program paired experienced healthcare workers with newer staff, ensuring that compassionate care became part of the hospital's DNA. Even the physical environment was changing. The walls, once blank and institutional, now featured artwork created by local artists and schoolchildren. Volunteers brought therapy dogs to visit patients. The cafeteria menu was revamped to offer healthier, more appealing options. 1 month after the incident, Ming was ready to be discharged. Her recovery was progressing well, though she would need physical therapy to regain full strength in her leg. On her last day, something unexpected happened. The emergency room staff organized a small farewell gathering. "You might not realize it," the ER director told Ming, "but you've helped create real change here. Your experience, as difficult as it was, opened our eyes to problems we had ignored for too long." The gathering turned into an impromptu sharing session, with staff members talking about the positive changes they'd witnessed. A security guard described how the new assessment system had helped identify a stroke patient quickly, potentially saving their life. An administrative assistant shared how the patient advocate program had helped a non-English speaking family navigate their child's care. Even Mr. Patel, the retired teacher who had tried to help Ming that first day, came to visit. He had become a volunteer at the hospital, helping to comfort families in the waiting room. Sometimes, he told Ming, it takes a difficult moment to spark important changes. Dr. Chen watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction. The hospital was becoming what he had always envisioned, not just a place of medical treatment, but a true center of healing and compassion. As Ming prepared to leave, Nurse Walsh appeared one last time, pushing a wheelchair as hospital policy required for discharged patients. She looked different now, more present, more connected. The steel wall of efficiency she had hidden behind was gone, replaced by genuine care. "Ready to go home?" she asked Ming warmly. Ming nodded, then paused. "You know, I think everything happened the way it was supposed to. Not that it was good, but look at all the good that came from it." As they made their way through the hospital corridors, they passed the emergency room. It was busy, as always, but there was a different atmosphere now. Patients were being attended to promptly, staff members moved with purpose but not panic, and there was an underlying sense of care and attention that hadn't existed before. Outside, the autumn sun was bright, and a cool breeze carried the scent of nearby flowering trees. Ming took one last look at the hospital before getting into her father's car. The building looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything had changed, and those changes would continue to touch countless lives in the years to come. This wasn't just a story about a broken leg or a negligent nurse. It was about how one moment of crisis could lead to lasting positive change, about how systems could be transformed when people remembered the human element in healthcare. Metropolitan General had become a model for what a hospital could be, a place where efficiency and compassion worked hand in hand. 3 months after Ming's incident, Metropolitan General had become almost unrecognizable to its longtime staff members. The changes Dr. Chen had implemented were now deeply rooted in the hospital's daily operations, and the results were remarkable. One busy morning, Dr. Chen stood in the emergency room, observing the new system in action. The waiting room was full, but there was none of the previous tension or frustration. A young mother sat comforting her feverish toddler while a triage nurse regularly checked on them. An elderly man with a sprained ankle was having his vital signs monitored every 15 minutes. The new patient advocate was helping a family fill out forms in their native language. Nurse Walsh, who had completed her retraining program, was now one of the strongest advocates for the new approach. She moved efficiently between patients, but with a warmth that would have been unimaginable just months ago. Her transformation had become an inspiration to other staff members who initially resisted the changes. "You know what the biggest difference is?" she told Dr. Chen during a brief break. "Before, I thought being professional meant keeping emotional distance. Now I understand that true professionalism means knowing how to care while still maintaining boundaries." The hospital's new protocols had become a model for other healthcare facilities in the region. Dr. Chen regularly received calls from hospital administrators asking about the changes they'd implemented. He always started by telling them Ming's story, not because she was his daughter, but because it perfectly illustrated how a single incident could expose systemic problems. The new emergency room procedures were straightforward but effective. Every patient was assessed within 15 minutes of arrival. A color-coded system helped staff prioritize cases while ensuring no one was forgotten. Regular check-ins meant that patients' conditions were monitored continuously, catching any deterioration quickly. But the changes went beyond the emergency room. Every department had undergone its own transformation. The pediatric ward now had volunteer storytellers who helped distract children during procedures. The surgical wing had implemented a new family communication system that kept relatives updated during long operations. Even the billing department had been reformed to be more patient-friendly. One morning, a familiar face appeared in the emergency room, Mr. Patel, the retired teacher who had tried to help Ming during her ordeal. This time, he wasn't there as a concerned bystander, but as the head of the hospital's new volunteer program. "I never expected to spend my retirement in a hospital," he told Dr. Chen with a smile. But after what I witnessed that day with your daughter, I knew I wanted to be part of the solution. Now we have 50 volunteers who help make patients and families feel less alone. The training programs Dr. Chen had instituted were making a significant impact. New staff members went through intensive compassion training alongside their medical orientation. Experienced staff participated in regular workshops that combined technical updates with emotional intelligence training. Even the maintenance and cafeteria staff were included, recognizing that every person in the hospital contributed to the healing environment. One of the most successful initiatives was the Walk in Their Shoes program, where staff members spent time as simulated patients, experiencing the hospital from the other side. It had opened many eyes to the small discomforts and anxieties that patients faced. It changed my whole perspective, one nurse shared during a staff meeting. I realized that what seems routine to us can be terrifying for patients. Now I explain everything I'm doing, no matter how simple it seems. The physical changes to the hospital continued as well. The walls now featured a rotating gallery of artwork from local schools. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been replaced with softer, more natural alternatives. Gardens were being planted in the courtyards, creating peaceful spaces for patients and staff alike. Ming, now fully recovered and back at school, sometimes visited the hospital with her basketball team to spend time with young patients in the pediatric ward. Her experience had inspired her to consider a career in healthcare, though she often joked that she'd learned more about how not to run a hospital than how to run one. During one of her visits, she encountered a teenager with a broken arm in the emergency room. The girl was nervous, but the staff's attentive care had kept her calm. Ming shared her own story with her, and they'd both marveled at how different their experiences had been. "It's like two different hospitals," Ming told her father later. "Sometimes it's hard to believe that all these changes happened because of one bad day." Dr. Chen shook his head. "Not because of one bad day," he corrected. "Because of one necessary wake-up call. The problems were always there. We just needed something to make us face them." The hospital's reputation in the community had transformed. Where once people dreaded visits to Metropolitan General, they now spoke of it as a place of genuine care. Emergency response teams preferentially brought patients there, knowing they would receive not just medical treatment, but compassionate attention. Even the hospital's financial health had improved. Better patient care led to better outcomes, which meant shorter stays and fewer complications. Patient satisfaction scores had skyrocketed, and staff turnover had dropped significantly. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the daily interactions between staff and patients. The simple human connections that had been lost in the maze of procedures and protocols were now central to the hospital's mission. It wasn't just about treating illnesses anymore, it was about caring for people. As Dr. Chen often said in his talks to other hospital administrators, medicine can heal the body, but compassion heals the person. The transformation of Metropolitan General proved that efficiency and humanity could coexist in healthcare. It just took the courage to put people first. 6 months after the incident that changed Metropolitan General, the hospital held a special community open house. The event was meant to showcase the transformations that had taken place, but it turned into something much more meaningful, a celebration of what healthcare could be when compassion led the way. The main lobby was filled with current and former patients sharing their stories. Among them was Ming, now fully recovered and back to playing basketball. She stood with Priya, talking to visitors about how a crisis had turned into an opportunity for positive change. "It's strange to think about that day now," Ming told a group of nursing students. "The pain was terrible, but what stays with me is how the experience changed not just our hospital, but how people think about healthcare in our whole community." Nurse Walsh, who had become one of the hospital's most respected staff members, was leading tours of the emergency department. She didn't shy away from telling her part of the story, how she had lost her way and found it again through the changes that followed. "Sometimes we need to fall to learn how to stand up stronger," she told visitors. "I thought I was being professional by being detached. Now I know that true professionalism means finding the right balance between efficiency and empathy." The emergency room itself had become a model of modern healthcare. Gone were the long waits and cold interactions. Instead, visitors saw a well-orchestrated system where every patient received prompt attention and regular updates. The new Triage system, now copied by hospitals across the state, ensured that no one was forgotten or overlooked. Mr. Patel, whose volunteer program had grown to include over 100 community members, hosted a session about the importance of human connection in healing. Medicine is crucial, he explained, but sometimes a kind word or a listening ear can be just as healing as any medication. Throughout the day, different departments showcased their innovations. The pediatric ward demonstrated their new child-friendly approach to procedures using games and storytelling to reduce anxiety. The surgical department explained their family communication system that kept relatives informed during operations. Dr. Chen moved through the crowds, listening more than speaking. He heard stories from patients who had experienced both the old and new versions of Metropolitan General. Their testimonials were powerful, tales of how fear had been replaced with trust, how confusion had given way to clarity. One elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "I was here last month for my heart problems," she said. "I was so scared, but everyone, from the cleaning staff to the doctors, made me feel cared for. They didn't just treat my heart condition, they treated me as a person." The hospital staff had organized their own presentations, sharing before and after stories of how their work lives had changed. A young nurse described how the new protocols had given her the confidence to speak up when she noticed potential problems with patients. An experienced doctor admitted that the compassion training had helped him reconnect with why he chose medicine in the first place. In the afternoon, Ming's basketball team arrived to play an exhibition game in the hospital's new rehabilitation center. The game was more than entertainment, it was a symbol of recovery and resilience. Ming moved across the court with confidence, her healed leg showing no signs of the trauma it had endured. During a break in the game, Dr. Chen addressed the gathered crowd. "6 months ago, our hospital lost its way," he said. "We had the medical knowledge, we had the technology, but we had forgotten the most important element of healthcare, the human connection. Today, we're not just celebrating changes in procedures or policies. We're celebrating a return to what healthcare should always be, a combination of medical excellence and human compassion." The changes at Metropolitan General had rippled out into the broader medical community. Other hospitals sent their staff to learn from their example. Medical schools requested information about their compassion training programs. Healthcare administrators studied their patient-first protocols. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the daily lives of patients and staff. The emergency room, once a place of stress and tension, had become a model of efficient, compassionate care. Nurse Walsh, who had once been the symbol of what was wrong with the system, was now training other nurses in the art of balancing efficiency with empathy. As the open house drew to a close, Ming and her father stood in the emergency room where their story had begun. The space looked different now, warmer, more welcoming, but the real change was in how it felt. There was a sense of purpose, of caring, that permeated every interaction. "You know, Dad," Ming said, watching a nurse gently comfort a worried child, "sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes." Dr. Chen nodded, remembering the anger and fear he had felt that day 6 months ago. "The important thing," he replied, "is not just making changes, but making sure they last. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity and compassion." As visitors left the open house, many stopped to leave notes on a large board in the lobby. The messages spoke of hope, gratitude, and transformation. They told the story of a hospital that had learned from its mistakes and emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to its true purpose, helping people heal body and soul. The story of Metropolitan General became more than just a tale of one hospital's transformation. It became a reminder that in healthcare, as in life, it's never too late to change, to improve, to remember what matters most. The human element, the simple act of caring, could transform not just procedures and protocols, but the very heart of healing itself.